Brad from Ocean Visions. Do you mind introducing yourself?
No, not at all. Thank you. Yes, Brad Ack. I'm the CEO of an organization called Ocean Visions, which is a conservation organization focused on restoring the health of the ocean. And in order to do that, we work almost entirely on climate issues because climate is the biggest driver of dangerous change to the ocean.
Still fixing things. I apologize. How did you get started in this organization? What got you over there?
So a little bit about my background. I've been in the conservation world my entire career. So conservation of biological diversity, preservation of nature. I started my career working in Latin America, where I spent 7 years on large landscape conservation, tropical forests, coral reefs, beautiful places that we were trying to protect for all time that were being dramatically impacted by local pressures from people, such as people who needed land for agriculture or wood for housing, or meat for food. And so my early days in conservation were all about balancing that human footprint. And as I progressed in my career, I spent 10 years in the American Southwest and then 15 years in the Northwest, working on the Puget Sound and on global fisheries, and then back to a global ocean role at World Wildlife Fund. Throughout that entire trajectory, it's always been about trying to manage the human footprint in on whatever we want to protect. If we want to have living nature around us, which we have to have for our own well-being, as well as the importance of stewardship for the future, we have to manage footprints. And through my career, climate and climate change, which sort of started as this distant cloud on the horizon back when I began, is now the overwhelming dominant black cloud in the sky. It affects everything we care about on the planet. It affects every possible future that we have. And it certainly affects the conservation of nature. And so the last 5 years I've spent helping create this organization, Ocean Visions, which is dedicated just entirely to dealing with the climate crisis from an ocean perspective. And the reason that we do that is because the ocean is the largest part of the planet. And if you're going to tackle a problem as big as the changing climate globally, you're going to have to understand the role of the ocean in climate and the role of the ocean potentially in helping get us to a future that is low carbon and where we've actually cleaned up legacy carbon from the environment and where we've maintained ocean ecosystems that are so critical in regulating temperature and weather. So our agenda is entirely focused on helping to slow, ultimately reverse the climate crisis using the power of the ocean.
Right. How do you, and this is a big question, I apologize, but how do you bridge that disconnect between, you have local forces, you're dealing with locals anywhere in the world with ocean, with small but big problems, and then you deal with CEOs that are seeing this as a 360 view, that are just trying to fix their balance sheet. And they're seeing, we've heard this a little bit earlier, at Davos, at these big conferences, that see the Amazon and a tree there just as a piece of lumber and a number on a balance sheet. How do you bridge that?
Yeah, that's a very good and difficult question. No simple answer to that. I think that one of the problems that we face right now is that we are underestimating the risk in the system. And that is in part a result of human nature to underestimate future risks and to sort of focus more on the immediate present. And that's certainly part of the corporate structure, just the way public companies are evaluated. That's just built in. But it's also part of human nature. We've been told over and over by scientists from around the world who have come together and signed letters and created warnings to humanity. They've told us and they've produced the information that has laid out very clearly what's going to happen, and that much of that has happened as projected and what will happen, and we continue to ignore it. So that really the biggest problem that we face is underestimating the risk and therefore not responding adequately. So just an example from your own personal health: if you don't think that you have a serious health problem, but you do, let's say you really have a very serious health problem, it could potentially be fatal, but you don't think that you have that, you're not going to take the steps necessary to address that. But if you truly believe that you have a chance of having a fatal illness, you will do almost anything to avoid that outcome. And we're not aware of the gravity of, we're not aware enough as a society of the gravity of the situation.
And not only that, I believe there is a disconnect between, selfishness of the top 1%, because they're still going to be fine for the longest time. It's not going to be their lifetime or the lifetime of their kids, who are also financially fine, right? But how do we make these solutions, your solutions against wildfires that we're seeing in California, really any climate change solutions, how do we make them financeable so that the big corporations not only want to do good, but are financially encouraged to do so?
Yeah. Another great question. First, let me just comment on the first part of your statement. I don't think there's safety for anybody. I don't think you can wall off your existence from a planet that is increasingly hot, with oceans that are increasingly acidified and food sources that are threatened globally, in part just because of the upheaval, the social and economic upheaval of that, but also because we are interdependent. So maybe on Mars, maybe those few people that want to live on a barren environment with no ability to go outside, maybe they'll survive that. But ultimately, we're in this together. And I think the fires in California show that they've affected some of the wealthiest people on the planet, and obviously a lot of others who aren't wealthy. Um, your question about how do you monetize climate action is one of the most important questions. It would be exceedingly simple through a carbon tax or a cost on carbon, right? If we had a cost on carbon, the social cost of carbon is estimated to be about $240 a ton. That means all of the negative impacts of a ton of carbon pollution. If we taxed it at that level, we would see a rapid monetization and race for all of the innovation that would help us decarbonize our society. And if we had a further, let's say a digital coin based on tons of carbon removed, every ton of carbon removed, you got a coin globally. So it would actually be based on a real value. We would see a race for carbon removal. So there are ways that this could happen. They're just not currently in our political realities, but our political realities are uh, not dealing with the problem that we face, or any of the problems that we face, really, right?
Right. They're looking at, I call it the Wizard of Oz issue. It's a wonderful curtain that we're not looking behind. But going back to the coins, there are companies that, provide solutions. We talked to Max Song, who's also in the ocean business. I'm sure you know of him. And he did a digital coin a couple of years ago, and the hype was big, for not using an oil field in Iceland. So why didn't it take off? Why didn't things like that become the standard for every climate company on the planet? Why aren't people investing in these things yet? Is it just that green energy isn't doing well on the stock market? Why is that still the case? Why are we not all fronts, all hands on deck?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of investment in green energy. So I don't want to leave the impression with people that this is not a thriving and growing market. I think it really is. And I think, as I don't know who famously said it, but I know Al Gore's repeated it. We didn't end the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. And we won't end the fossil fuel age because we run out of fossil fuels. At least I hope that's not how it ends. We will end it because we replace fossil fuels with much cleaner and safer and smarter choices of energy. And there are thousands and thousands of people working on those, and many, many investors. And, from our perspective, we're looking at what the ocean can provide in that way. And so the ocean Obviously, the biggest one that everybody will know about is offshore wind, which is already a mature industry, very well built up in Europe and not so much in the U.S. for a variety of reasons. But the technology is ready, and that one is a sector that should grow. But there are a lot of more emerging clean energy from the ocean opportunities, like floating solar, non-grid connected wind for smaller uses, wave energy and tidal energy, and temperature gradient energy. And we need to spur more investment in those areas. And there are really great opportunities for private sector investment in those areas, because they will replace dirty energy, and they'll do it in a way that is faster and cheaper and cleaner and more acceptable to people. But they need that investment. And clearly there are companies like Breakthrough Energy Ventures that are at the forefront of finding those investments, finding those innovators, helping support them. ARPA-E in the United States, the ARIA program in the UK, and others.
Interesting enough, there's currently a show, I don't know if you're aware of it, it's called Landman. And they had a beautiful scene actually on wind energy, renewable energy, and how much fossil fuel it takes to put one piece of wind energy up in the middle of a desert. Now, how much of this traditional energy do we need to create non-traditional green energy? Is it worth it? How do we speed this up? How do we make it cleaner from the beginning? How do we not shoot ourselves in the foot setting all this up?
Yeah, that's a great question. The overall additionality of or the overall reduction of carbon from clean energy has to factor in the amount of carbon that went into creating the turbines and moving them and setting them up. But I think over time, as we put more of our attention to this and start to focus some of these new tools like AI and so forth onto these problems, we're gonna crack that problem, I think, pretty readily. We already know that solar is the fastest, cheapest source of energy on the planet, right? And that does account for the carbon footprint of creating panels and moving them around. But there are what we would call incumbent interests, to put it nicely, which really is the oil and gas block, which is not just companies, but also petrostates. Right. So it's not just private companies, but large states that have created obstacles to every advance for renewable energy on the planet. And we have to deal with that. We can't pretend that that's not the case. These things aren't failing because they're not economically viable. They're failing because there are incumbents standing in their way. If they're failing, they're not moving fast enough because there are incumbents standing in their way, pretty clearly trying to stop their progress.
Right. Um, Now, you mentioned AI. How do you guys use AI to further Ocean Visions, to further your guys' projects? How is that now flowing into the business?
Yeah, so let me just go back a little bit to what we do. So we have an agenda that we call the 4 Rs for addressing the ocean climate crisis, the interlocking ocean climate crisis: reduce, remove, repair, and reach. So reduce is what we've just been talking about, all the ways that the ocean can help contribute to the needed transition to a low carbon economy. All those energy sources, blue foods, biomaterials, bioplastics, fertilizers, et cetera. There's a host of opportunities in the marine-based decarbonization, what we call reduce. Remove is carbon removal. We're already well past safe limits of carbon in the atmosphere. I mean, you don't need a scientist to tell you that, right? That it's the evidence is all around us, and California is only the most recent, but it is really just the most recent because there's just one after the other. So we need to also clean up legacy carbon, and the ocean has an enormous number of pathways to help us do that because it already is a natural cycler. So we can use the power of photosynthesis in the ocean to capture carbon and then store it. We can use the chemical processes in the ocean to move dissolved CO2 from the upper layer of the ocean into carbonates and bicarbonates in the deep. So there's a whole emerging industry around ocean-based carbon removal. The third R is repair, and that is based on the understanding that some of the most critical vital organs on the planet, like the Arctic, are changing faster than we can keep pace with climate action. And it may take interventions that slow some of those processes down to maintain stable systems. And interestingly, there's been a few papers on the connection between Arctic sea ice and Western wildfires, for example, Arctic sea ice and Indian monsoons. So we have a whole program focused on looking at technologies that might be able to help prolong Arctic sea ice. And that's a place where AI, for example, looking at large data sets, analyzing multiple different scenarios very quickly, helping to optimize potential approaches would be enormously important. The same with carbon removal, figuring out the most appropriate locations, the right times, maximizing manufacturing processes to minimize embedded carbon, et cetera. And then our last R is reach, which is about building the community, the much more diverse community of actors, both culturally, economically, socially, but also disciplinarily, that are going to be needed to solve this problem. So I would wager that it's less than a tenth of a percentage point of experts in AI that are dedicated their energies to climate. I'm just guessing. If it's 1%, I'd be amazed, right? They're all working on something else, probably important things, but we need to get their skill set and their minds onto the climate problem. Synthetic biology, robotics, nanotechnology. We need this sort of infusion of expertise from so many sectors if we're going to solve this challenge, which is the challenge that dwarfs everything else. If we don't solve this, all the other challenges are going to pale.
Right. How do you explain, or how do you get into the cultural disconnect between the United States that's still struggling so hard to make it possible to do climate intervention and climate change, fight of any sort? And me coming from Europe, in Germany, we take every plastic bottle back to the store, we get 10 cents back. Like any and all of these little actions, they make a big difference. Why don't we do that here? How can we change that? And how can we bring those simple little actions for every person into our daily lives?
I think we have to be really clear. There has been a massive disinformation campaign funded by primarily oil and gas interests for many, many years, and especially in the United States, where we allow corporations to finance the campaigns of politicians. We have a system that is largely owned, not owned, that's too far, that is strongly influenced, let's say, by the fossil fuel lobby. And so we also have this disinformation that this isn't even real. Right now, at the highest levels of US government, there is climate denial. I don't know how we move past that. I think we have to work with the willing. And I think Europe has to lead the way as an example. I think China has to lead the way. And I think India has to help lead the way. We aren't going to see the leadership from the federal part of the United States, but we will from states like California and Maine and Massachusetts and Alaska and others. We will see that leadership, New York, but we won't see it from the federal government, at least for the foreseeable future.
Okay, that's cheery. What specific project in Ocean Visions are you currently this year in 2025 most excited about?
Well, this work I've mentioned on Arctic sea ice, I think is really, really important, because the connection between keeping the Arctic white, meaning sea ice across much of the extent, and then therefore keeping the reflectivity at the top of the globe, is so critical to maintaining the Greenland ice sheet, to keeping northern permafrost frozen so that we don't release those greenhouse gases, to keeping the ocean circulation working the way they have for millennia. So starting to get people's attention again, and we're talking about the people who are tuned into these problems and who are willing, but starting to get people's attention around the possibility of being able to prolong these systems for the good of humanity while we slowly deal with heat on the planet through decarbonization and carbon removal. I'm very excited about that work, and about the fact that more and more people are finally realizing that these foundational ecosystems are critical to climate stability, and climate instability is a huge risk. And this is one area. Now let's go back to what sounded a little bit more gloomy. Climate risk and is a national security issue. And I think this administration is definitely concerned about national security and national security in the Arctic. So if we can help make the restoration of Arctic ice and a frozen Arctic part of a national security agenda, maybe we can make some progress there. I'm also really excited about the progress that a number of companies in the ocean carbon removal space are making. There's really a blossoming of talent and innovation in that space. We have a program called Launchpad, which provides technical engineering and scientific advice to startups. And so you can find those startups on our website for people who are looking more for financial opportunities for investment. But there are a lot of companies in the space. And on Earth Day this year, we will hear the winners of the Carbon Removal X Prize, which was $100 million prize created by none or funded by none other than Elon Musk 4 years ago, which has over the last 4 years been identifying carbon removal players across land, oceans, air, and I think they have one other category. And we'll be announcing three $30 million winners in April. And so that's been a great process. Thousands of companies were, I think, incentivized by that prize. And it'll be interesting to see how that comes out in April.
Well, good. I'm glad he's doing something in that space. That makes me a lot happier. Genuinely, let's keep it there.
Hopefully he still believes in it.
I hope so too. Let's just, putting his mind into climate change and into solutions for climate change would really benefit. That would solve more than one issue at a time.
I agree.
But give us something to look forward to this year that we all can do and partake in to help the ocean breathe.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most important thing we can do is make sure that we are aware that this is one of the most serious problems we face, and that we hold anybody in a position of power, elected or otherwise, accountable for taking the right action. It's really hard for an individual to be able to do much directly, but indirectly in terms of who you vote for, where you put your dollars that you spend, and what you ask of your elected officials and the people who run the companies that you're supporting. That's the most important high leverage thing that people can do.
All right. Switching to a little bit of, ocean water to our water, PFAS and the threats that they face. Any thoughts on that good subject?
Yeah, I mean, we have created a host of chemicals that we've put into things that we use every day, PFAS just being one example of those that have undergone very minimal testing. This again is another place where there's a really big difference with Europe. Europe has a much more rigorous process of allowing the introduction of new chemicals into food and into products. The US does not, and then we end up having to pay the price by really expensive cleanups or by enormous damage to human health. I wish I had something, really positive to offer. What we often see is it's the substitution, right? If you can create the substitution, which also requires innovation and potential risk, then you can displace something like these compounds, but it's not easy.
Right, unless you are Monsanto and you merge with Bayer, then you're creating the substitution and the solution to the problem that you also now bought. But hopefully we don't see that in ocean cleanup. Hopefully it will be a little cleaner from the start to finish line. Do you have a closing word for us? We have another 2 minutes before we move on to the next fireside chat. What message can you send to the Davos community?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that the power of investment is really important here. So it's kind of like what I just said about what an individual can do, but now multiplied by people who manage wealth for others, making really careful choices and ensuring that there is climate responsibility and proactive plans to manage climate risk among any company that you potentially engage in, and also investing in companies that are part of the leading edge of solutions. That is absolutely critical. And it might mean taking a smaller return for now, but a bigger return for the planet. And this, I guess, would be one of my closing thoughts, is that impact investing was never supposed to be about uh, making the exact same rate of return and having a big impact. I mean, that's just being greedy. It was about reducing your rate of return a little bit in order to have a much greater impact, and paying attention to the impact, not just chasing returns. And this is really, really important. We just saw some of the biggest banks in the world pull out of the net zero coalition, right? Because they read the writing on the wall from the Trump administration that was no longer a priority. Well, that's a real problem. So those family offices that have holdings in those banks should think about moving those holdings somewhere else, right? We've got to make it really clear that it is unacceptable to ignore this problem, and it is unacceptable to not act if we have the power to act.
Well, thank you, Brad. We appreciate you. Thank you for coming on to our program again and chatting with me. And I hope you have a wonderful day with some clean air and some clean water.
Thank you. Very lovely to talk to you, Annika.
Bye, Brad.
Okay. Bye-bye.